We want to say we support the bill and believe, like others have said, and just to echo it, that it needs amending, and we would welcome an answer from the Minister if he's open to amendments, and also if and when the framework around when this might be passed would be outlaid to us. Look, I mean, we've been through an epidemic of misogyny and gender-based violence against women, and because sometimes when you stop and think about it, it's quite extraordinary, and you wonder what the hell is going on in the world. Why has this taken off in the way that it has? But I think it's also important to be very clear to the population, to our own constituents, because there is muddled messages out there about why we see such a high level of sexual and gender-based violence in our society. And one of the messages is that the biggest threat to women and to children comes from the foreigners, comes from the refugees, particularly those who aren't from Ukraine, who come into this country and are a big threat to us all. They're unvetted, they're a threat to women and children. And I think we should use this opportunity in debating this bill to really scupper that notion and look at the statistics and look at the facts and look at the research coming from many organisations, local ones. Mick just quoted one to me from Cork, a Cork-based rape crisis centre, the National Rape Crisis Centre itself, the Commission for Human Rights and Equality. Most gender-based violence and sexual violence is committed and perpetrated on a person by somebody who is intimately known to them. The vast majority of some statistics give us over 80% of the sexual-based violence is perpetrated by somebody in a family or intimately known to the victim. So I think that's a very important point that we need to use this opportunity to get across, to cut out the hate-filled bile that is being misquoted and, if you like, permeated around our communities as we speak. And I say that very genuinely to my constituents, that they need to think twice about what they're hearing, what they're reading on social media, and what sort of bile is being passed as genuine information to them. Having said that, there is an epidemic in gender-based violence, and the responses to that have been really amazing. When you look back at the outburst after the murder of Aisling Murphy, and indeed after the murder of Sarah Everett, who was murdered in Britain by a member of the Metropolitan Police, you wonder, can you really trust any level of authority in this society? But the outburst of both emotion, anger and support for the victims has been really quite extraordinary and unprecedented. And I think, like Mick has argued, and I think like Thomas Pringle argued, that in many ways it's that response that has forced governments and ministers to look at changing the legislation around how victims of sexual and gender-based violence are used and abused in courts. We've loads and loads of examples of it. I won't repeat any of them here. But just to say, I also think that the question of sex education is hugely important, because if we go to the younger generation now with comprehensive, non-moralistic, non-ethos-based sex education and really explain to them about what consent actually means and how it is implemented in one's life, then we can look forward, I would hope, to future generations being much more open and much more kind to each other and much more receptive to each other, and that this sort of sexual perpetration against women, against girls and sometimes against boys will be removed from our society, not just by criminal law but by change in culture. Having said that, we do welcome elements of the bill, but we also want to support some of the criticisms, particularly from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commissioners. And just to quote them, I'm sure they wrote to you all, but I think it's worth quoting them. They say, "It is still no statutory protection from the prosecution for victims of human trafficking where a person has committed a crime as a direct consequence of them being trafficked. The United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights clearly states that victims should not be punished for any unlawful activities that arise as a result of trafficking." And I think that's really important that we look to amend this bill to include that in. The Commission is also disappointed to see that victims of sexual exploitation are still not afforded the same protection in criminal trials as the victims of other sexual offences. And by choosing not to extend separate legal representations to victims of sex trafficking, if there is an application to question them on their previous sexual experience, once again, this leaves these victims, who are disproportionately migrant women, with diminished protections in trials. And just to quote the criticism from the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, there was disappointment that there's no provision to ensure that victims have access to legal advice from the outset, as they need it during the investigation and the trial process. This was recognised as a necessary part of supporting victims in their journey through the justice system, and its absence denies victims the right to be fully informed and equipped to deal with the system, where they play such a crucial part in their own cases on behalf of all society. So, Minister, again, the question is, are we open in progressing this bill to amendments? Because there are very, very sensible and crucial points being made by these highly professional organisations who are informing us of the need to amend the bill. And finally, I just, like others, want to pay tribute to the women of honour. I think a lot of people will be surprised to know, and it's only because of them that we know, that persons subject to military law in the past and up to now, when they have committed sexual offences in the state, have been dealt with by court-martial rather than by Gardaí and civilian courts. And this bill will now change that. It'll only apply where court-martial will only apply where those offences are committed abroad. So this is a very, very welcome change, and all honour to the women of honour for campaigning to make sure that this was included in the bill.